December 7th, 1941. 7:55 a.m., Pearl Harbor territory of Hawaii. The morning sky is clear and pale blue above the harbor. The water reflects the quiet silhouettes of battleships lined neatly along Battleship Row. Smoke rises lazily from galley chimneys as breakfast is prepared aboard the ships of the United States Pacific Fleet. Across the island, church bells ring faintly in Honolulu. Sunday has begun like any other, but far above the clouds the sound of engines grows steadily louder. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida of the Imperial Japanese Navy leans forward inside the cockpit of his Nakajima B-5 N2 Type 97 carrier attack aircraft. The aircraft vibrates beneath him as it cuts through the morning air. Ahead, the coastline of Oahu spreads across the horizon. Behind him, more than 180 aircraft approach in formation. Mitsubishi A6M-20 fighters escort the bombers. Aichi, the 3A1, Type 99 dive bombers glide silently in formation. Below them, the ships of the U.S. Pacific Fleet sit unaware. Fuchida grips the microphone of his Type 96 radio transmitter. The signal must be precise. The timing must be perfect. He glances at his navigator and then back toward the harbor. Everything appears exactly as Japanese intelligence predicted. The fleet is in port. Battleships are grouped together. Anti-aircraft batteries remain unmanned in many locations. Radar stations have reported unidentified aircraft, but the warnings have not triggered alarms. It is the kind of surprise attack that the planners in Tokyo had imagined for years. Inside the Imperial Japanese Navy headquarters, months earlier, officers had discussed a belief that shaped the entire strategy. The United States, they believed, lacked the national will for a prolonged war. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto himself understood the risk of conflict with America. He had studied in the United States. He knew its industrial capacity. He knew the scale of its factories. But many within the Japanese Naval General Staff believed something different. They believed American society was soft. They believed the American public would not tolerate long casualties. They believed that if Japan struck quickly and decisively, public pressure in the United States would force Washington to negotiate. Victory in this doctrine did not require conquering America. It required shocking it. Destroy the Pacific Fleet. Seize the Western Pacific. Create a defensive perimeter too large to break. Then wait. The Americans would tire of the war. Negotiations would follow. The empire would survive. That belief had shaped every operational decision leading to this moment. Inside the cockpit, Fuchida watches the harbor grow larger. Battleships become visible through scattered clouds. USS Arizona, USS Oklahoma, USS West Virginia, USS California. Rows of American warships sit quietly along the docks. For a moment, the scene looks almost peaceful. He presses the transmitter. Tora. Tora, Tora. The coded message flashes through the radio network of the attacking fleet. Total surprise achieved. Seconds later, the sky begins to scream. Dive bombers peel downward like falling knives. The engines of Aichi D-3A1 aircraft howl as they drop toward the ships. Bomb racks release. Armor-piercing bombs fall toward the decks of American battleships. Meanwhile, torpedo bombers skim low over the water. Japanese engineers had modified the Type 91 aerial torpedo with wooden stabilizing fins so it could operate in the shallow waters of Pearl Harbor. Now those torpedoes streak across the harbor. The first one slams into USS Oklahoma. A dull underwater explosion shakes the massive hull. Another torpedo strikes, then another. Within minutes, the great battleship begins to roll. On board USS Arizona sailors are still gathering for morning colors when a bomb penetrates the forward deck. It punches through layers of armor before detonating in the ship's ammunition magazine. The explosion tears the ship open. A massive fireball rises hundreds of feet into the air. Across the harbor, anti-aircraft guns finally begin firing. But the attack has already shattered the morning calm. Machine guns from Mitsubishi, a 6M20s, rake the airfields at Hickam Field and Wheeler Field. American aircraft sit lined up wingtip to wingtip, easy targets for strafing runs. Pilots never reach their cockpits. Within the first hour, the Pacific Fleet suffers devastating damage. Battleships burn. Ships capsize. Hundreds of sailors are trapped inside flooded compartments. From the perspective of Japanese planners watching from thousands of miles away, the results appear exactly as predicted. A crushing surprise, a humiliating defeat, a demonstration of overwhelming force. In Tokyo, many officers believe this single morning has changed the course of the war before it has even begun. But the doctrine behind the attack is not only about military victory. It is about psychology. Japanese intelligence analysts had studied American politics. They believed the American public disliked war. They remembered the bitterness after the First World War. They believed isolationist movements inside the United States would grow stronger once casualties began. Even after Pearl Harbor, they predicted the American public would soon demand peace. Perhaps after the Philippines fell. Perhaps after Singapore. Perhaps after a series of naval defeats. But soon. The assumption is quiet but powerful. The American people will not endure long hardship. Inside the Imperial Japanese Navy Carrier Strike Force, Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo watches the attack unfold through binoculars from the deck of the aircraft carrier Akagi. Columns of smoke rise from the harbor. Battleships burn. Aircraft explode on runways. The attack has succeeded beyond expectations. Staff officers begin discussing the next wave of strikes. Oil storage tanks remain untouched. Repair facilities remain intact. But the main objective has already been achieved. The American Pacific Fleet has been crippled. For many Japanese officers, the conclusion seems obvious. The United States will be shocked, demoralized, and uncertain. Negotiation will follow. But across the burning harbor, something else is already happening. American sailors climb into anti-aircraft guns. Damage control teams fight fires with hoses and pumps. Pilots scramble to launch the few surviving aircraft. Inside the chaos, anger spreads faster than fear. No one here is talking about negotiation. But thousands of miles away, the Japanese planners cannot see that yet. For now, they believe the doctrine has been proven correct. They believe America has just been broken, and the war has only begun. December 8, 1941, 12:30 p.m., Imperial Japanese Navy Ministry, Tokyo. The conference room is filled with cigarette smoke and the quiet scratch of pencils across paper. Officers in dark naval uniforms lean over large operational maps spread across the table. Colored pins mark the Pacific Ocean from Hawaii to the Philippines, from Malaya to the Dutch East Indies. Vice Admiral Osumi Nagano, Chief of the Naval General Staff, listens as staff officers report the first confirmed results from Pearl Harbor. 8 American battleships damaged or sunk. Hundreds of aircraft destroyed. Airfields devastated. More than 2,000 American casualties. For a moment, the room is silent. Then, several officers nod with restrained satisfaction. The plan has worked. But the conversation quickly shifts to something more important than the damage itself. The reaction of the United States. Captain Sadatoshi Tomioka, one of the planners who helped design the Pearl Harbor operation, taps the edge of the map with his pencil. "The shock will be immense," he says quietly. Several officers agree. Japanese doctrine has long assumed that the American public, once faced with severe early defeats, would begin to question the war. Newspapers would demand accountability. Political leaders would face pressure. Negotiations would eventually follow. The United States, they believed, had entered previous conflicts reluctantly. Many Japanese strategists viewed American society as prosperous, comfortable, and unwilling to sustain long suffering. In their calculations, a short, brutal series of victories would force a political solution. But even as the officers in Tokyo speak with calm confidence, events are already unfolding far away that challenge those assumptions. In Washington, D.C., the atmosphere is nothing like the Japanese planners imagined. December 8, 1941. 1:00 p.m., United States Capitol Building. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt sits in a wheelchair behind a small desk in the House chamber. The room is packed with members of Congress. Journalists fill the balconies. Outside, thousands of citizens gather on the streets. Roosevelt adjusts the papers in front of him and begins to speak. Yesterday, December the 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The words travel through radios across the United States. Families listen in kitchens. Factory workers gather around loudspeakers. Soldiers pause inside barracks. The anger that spreads across the country is immediate and overwhelming. Within hours, Congress votes to declare war on Japan. Only one vote in the entire chamber opposes it. No serious discussion of negotiation appears anywhere. No political hesitation. Instead, something else begins to take shape: mobilization. Inside the War Department, officers begin expanding plans that had existed only on paper. General George C. Marshall, Chief of Staff of the United States Army, studies reports arriving from the Pacific. The situation is worse than expected. American forces in the Philippines are under attack. Japanese aircraft strike Clark Field with devastating accuracy. General Douglas MacArthur struggles to reorganize his scattered units. Across Southeast Asia, Japanese forces advance rapidly. British defenses in Malaya begin collapsing under coordinated air and ground assaults. In the Dutch East Indies, Japanese naval forces begin preparing for invasion. Everything appears to confirm the assumptions made by Japanese planners. Their early victories are sweeping. Their forces move quickly. Their opponents appear disorganized. But beneath the surface, another process begins that Japanese intelligence does not fully understand. Inside American factories, December 10, 1941, Detroit, Michigan. The Ford Motor Company plant in Dearborn is already operating around the clock. The massive industrial complex stretches across acres of factory floor. Assembly lines that once produced automobiles begin shifting toward military contracts. Trucks, aircraft engines, armored vehicles. The transition happens faster than many expected. Henry Ford had already experimented with large-scale manufacturing methods that allowed thousands of identical machines to be built quickly. Now the federal government begins expanding those methods to wartime production. The United States Navy issues emergency orders for new ships. Aircraft manufacturers receive massive contracts. The industrial machinery of an entire nation begins turning toward war. Japanese intelligence officers in Tokyo receive reports about American industrial capacity. But many interpret the information through their existing assumptions. Yes, the United States has large factories. Yes, it has immense resources. But they believe the American public will not tolerate the sacrifices required to sustain long conflict. They believe political divisions inside the United States will grow. They believe that the memory of the First World War still lingers. Inside the Imperial Japanese Navy headquarters, planners focus on their next objectives. The Philippines must fall quickly. Singapore must be captured. The defensive perimeter of the empire must expand across the Pacific. Once these territories secured, Japan will possess the oil, rubber, and raw materials needed to sustain its war effort. And once the perimeter is established, they believe the United States will hesitate to attack it. Casualties would be too high. Public support would weaken. Negotiations would begin. But some officers inside the Japanese government feel uneasy. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander of the Combined Fleet, had warned about this before the war even began. He had studied the United States closely during his years as naval attaché in Washington. He knew the scale of American industry. He knew the population size. He knew that if the war lasted long enough, Japan might face an enemy capable of producing warships, aircraft, and weapons at a pace no other nation could match. In private conversations, Yamamoto had expressed a quiet fear. "I shall run wild for 6 months," he once said. "After that, I have no expectation of success." But those doubts remain largely hidden behind the confidence of early victories. Because in December 1941, the war still appears to be unfolding exactly as Japanese planners expected. American bases are burning. Allied defenses collapse across Southeast Asia. Japanese forces advance rapidly through the Pacific. The doctrine seems confirmed. Strike hard, shock the enemy, force a political settlement. But far away from the conference rooms in Tokyo, the reaction inside the United States continues moving in a direction no Japanese intelligence report predicted. Anger does not fade. It grows. Factories expand production instead of slowing. Volunteers flood recruitment offices. Instead of demanding negotiation, American newspapers demand revenge. And the Japanese planners who built their strategy on American weakness have not yet realized the scale of the mistake. April 18, 1942. 8:20 a.m. Pacific Ocean, 650 miles east of Japan. The wind cuts sharply across the flight deck of the aircraft carrier USS Hornet. Lieutenant Colonel James Harold Doolittle stands inside the cockpit of a North American B-25B Mitchell bomber. The twin engines vibrate beneath him as sailors pull away the final wheel chocks. The bomber looks enormous compared to the short deck of the carrier. Medium bombers were never designed to launch from aircraft carriers. Yet 16 of them now sit lined up along the wooden deck. Behind Hornet, the aircraft carrier USS Enterprise moves through gray swells with her own fighters circling overhead. Together, the task force pushes west toward the Japanese home islands. But something has gone wrong. Hours earlier, radar operators aboard the cruiser USS Nashville detected a small vessel ahead. Moments later, lookouts confirmed it. A Japanese picket boat. Before it could escape, American gunners destroyed it. But the damage had already been done. The ship had transmitted a warning. Japanese coastal defense stations now knew that American naval forces were approaching. Admiral William F. Halsey, Jr. understands the risk immediately. The bombers were supposed to launch much closer to Japan. Now they must take off nearly 200 miles farther away. Fuel will be dangerously tight. But waiting longer might allow Japanese aircraft to intercept the task force. Halsey turns to Doolittle. Launch the planes. On the deck of Hornet, sailors signal forward. Doolittle pushes the throttles forward. The bomber begins to roll. The short runway seems impossibly small. Ocean waves crash against the hull as the carrier rises and falls beneath the aircraft. For a moment, it appears the heavy bomber may not lift. Then the wings catch air. The B-25 climbs slowly above the gray Pacific sky. One by one, the other bombers follow. 16 aircraft head west toward Japan. Inside the Imperial Japanese Navy headquarters in Tokyo, no one yet realizes what is coming. Japanese intelligence still believes the American fleet remains crippled after Pearl Harbor. Yes. American submarines have begun operating in the Pacific. Yes, scattered naval skirmishes have occurred. But the idea that American bombers could reach the Japanese home islands seems unlikely. Japanese planners had assumed that the distance across the Pacific provided a natural shield. Their defensive perimeter was expanding rapidly. Singapore had fallen in February. The Philippines were nearly conquered. Japanese forces now controlled vast regions of Southeast Asia. The empire appeared stronger with each passing month. Inside the capital, life continued with cautious confidence. But at 12:25 p.m., the air raid sirens begin to scream. Across Tokyo, civilians look up in confusion. Few believe the warning is real. Then engines appear above the clouds. The first B-25 dives over the rooftops. Bombay, doors open. Explosions ripple through industrial districts and dockyards. Another bomber races low across Tokyo Bay. Anti-aircraft guns scramble to respond, but the attack is already unfolding. Within minutes, bombs fall on Yokohama, Yokosuka, Nagoya, Kobe. The physical damage is limited. The bombers carry only modest payloads. Many bombs land in open areas, but the psychological effect is immediate. For the first time in modern history, enemy aircraft have struck the Japanese home islands. Inside government buildings, officials stare at damage reports arriving from across the country. How had this happened? Where had the bombers come from? The Imperial Japanese Navy begins a frantic search of the Pacific. Carrier groups move outward from Japan. Patrol aircraft sweep across the ocean, but the American carriers have already disappeared into the vast Pacific. Meanwhile, the 16 bombers continue west toward China. Most run out of fuel before reaching their landing zones. Several crash, others force emergency landings. But the raid has already accomplished something far more important than physical destruction. It has shattered a critical assumption. Inside Japanese intelligence circles, analysts begin examining the implications. The United States Navy still possesses offensive capability. American pilots are willing to attempt extremely dangerous operations. More troubling, the American public reaction to the raid appears enthusiastic. Newspapers across the United States celebrate the attack. Photographs of Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle appear on front pages. Crowds cheer the news that American aircraft have bombed Tokyo. The raid does not weaken American morale. It strengthens it. Japanese intelligence officers studying foreign press reports notice something unusual. Instead of war fatigue, American society appears energized. Recruitment numbers increase. War bond drives expand. Factories continue increasing production. Inside the Japanese Naval General Staff, some officers begin to reconsider earlier assumptions. Perhaps the United States will not collapse politically after early defeats. Perhaps American society is capable of sustaining long war after all. But many leaders still dismiss these concerns. The Doolittle raid caused little physical damage. Japan still controls enormous territory. Its fleets remain powerful. Its armies continue advancing. Surely the American public will lose enthusiasm once casualties begin mounting. Surely a few bombing raids cannot change the balance of power. Yet Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto sees the event differently. The raid proves that Japan's defensive perimeter is incomplete. If American carriers can approach Japan undetected once they can do it again, he proposes a bold solution: destroy the remaining American carrier fleet. Lure them into a decisive battle near a remote island called Midway. Once the American carriers are sunk, the United States will lose its ability to strike across the Pacific. Morale will collapse. Negotiation will become inevitable. The plan begins taking shape. But hidden within the celebration of early victories and the desire for decisive battle lies a dangerous misunderstanding. The Doolittle raid has already shown something Japanese planners did not expect. The more America is attacked, the stronger its determination becomes. And the next encounter between the two navies will reveal just how dangerous that misunderstanding truly is. June 4th, 1942. 4:30 a.m. North Pacific Ocean, northeast of Midway Atoll. A gray dawn creeps slowly across the cold Pacific water. Low clouds drift above a restless sea as 4 Japanese aircraft carriers move in formation through the early morning darkness. Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu. Together they form the heart of Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo's 1st Carrier Striking Force. On the flight deck of the carrier, Akagi mechanics rush between aircraft lined up in perfect rows. Nakajima B-5N2 torpedo bombers sit beside Aichi D-3A dive bombers. Mitsubishi A-6M20 fighters idle nearby, their engines warming in the chilly air. Deck crews move with precise discipline, guiding aircraft into launch position. Inside the command bridge, Nagumo watches the growing light of morning through binoculars. The operation unfolding around him is the largest and most complex naval attack Japan has attempted since Pearl Harbor. The objective is simple: capture Midway Atoll, destroy the remaining American aircraft carriers, break American naval power permanently in the Pacific. Once the United States Navy loses its carriers, Japanese planners believe the war will effectively end. Without offensive capability across the vast Pacific, the Americans will be forced to accept Japan's defensive perimeter. Negotiation will follow. It is the same strategic logic that shaped Pearl Harbor. Strike hard enough, shock the enemy, force political collapse. At 4:45 a.m., the first wave begins launching. Aircraft roar down the flight decks one by one, lifting into the pale sky. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, who had led the attack at Pearl Harbor, watches from his sickbed aboard Akagi. Illness prevents him from flying today, but he listens to radio traffic as the strike group heads toward Midway. 108 aircraft now race toward the island. Dive bombers, torpedo bombers, fighters. They expect to face weak resistance. Japanese intelligence believes the American carriers are far away. But far to the northeast, hidden beyond the horizon, 3 American aircraft carriers wait in silence. USS Enterprise, USS Hornet, USS Yorktown. Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, commander of the United States Pacific Fleet, has taken a risk that few Japanese planners considered possible. American cryptographers had broken key elements of Japanese naval communications inside a small intelligence unit called Station Hypo in Pearl Harbor. Commander Joseph Rochefort and his team had spent weeks analyzing encrypted messages. The result is extraordinary. They know the target is Midway. They know the approximate date. They even know the composition of the attacking fleet. Instead of retreating after Pearl Harbor, the American Navy has quietly rebuilt its striking force. Now the carriers wait in ambush. But aboard Nagumo's carriers, none of this is visible. At 6:20 a.m., the first Japanese aircraft arrive over Midway. Anti-aircraft guns erupt from the island's defenses. Marine Corps fighter pilots scramble into the air. F-4, F Wildcat fighters climb toward the incoming Japanese formations. The battle begins instantly. Zeros engage the American fighters. Bombers dive toward the airfields. Explosions ripple across the island. The attack damages installations but does not destroy the base completely. Midway continues launching aircraft even as bombs fall. Inside the bridge of Akagi, Nagumo receives the first damage reports. The airfield is still operational. A second strike will likely be required. But at 7:28 a.m., another report arrives. A Japanese scout plane from the cruiser Tone has finally located part of the American fleet. The message is incomplete. Enemy ships sighted, Course and distance uncertain. Crucially, the report does not immediately confirm the presence of aircraft carriers. Nagumo faces a difficult decision. His aircraft returning from the Midway strike will soon need to land. Meanwhile, the planes already prepared on deck are armed with bombs for attacking the island. If American ships are nearby, those aircraft should be rearmed with torpedoes. Inside the carrier hangars, ordnance crews begin the dangerous process of changing weapons. Bombs are removed. Torpedoes are brought up. Fuel hoses remain connected. Aircraft are repositioned inside cramped hangar decks. The carriers temporarily become floating warehouses of explosives. Meanwhile, American aircraft have already begun searching for the Japanese fleet. From Midway itself, waves of American bombers launch toward Nagumo's carriers. Army Air Forces, B-17 Flying Fortress bombers appear first, dropping bombs from high altitude. None hit. Next come Marine Corps dive bombers, then torpedo bombers from Midway. The attacks are disorganized and costly. Japanese Zero fighters intercept them aggressively. American aircraft fall burning into the sea. Yet the attacks achieve something else. They keep Nagumo's attention focused on defending against incoming threats. Inside the carrier hangars, rearming operations continue. Fuel lines remain open. Aircraft crowd the decks. Then, shortly after 9:20 a.m., another American attack appears. Torpedo Squadron 8 from USS Hornet. 15 slow-moving Douglas TBD Devastator torpedo bombers approach at low altitude. Japanese fighters swarm them instantly. One by one, the Devastators are shot down. Not a single torpedo strikes its target. But the attack forces Japanese fighters to descend to sea level. Above the battle, unseen through scattered clouds, another group of aircraft approaches. Douglas SBD Dauntless, dive bombers from USS Enterprise. Their pilots scan the ocean below. Suddenly, the Japanese carrier formation appears through a gap in the clouds. 4 carriers sailing in formation. Flight decks crowded with aircraft. Fuel lines open. Bombs and torpedoes stacked across hangar decks. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey rolls his aircraft into a steep dive. Within seconds, dozens of American dive bombers follow. And the assumptions that shaped Japan's entire strategy are about to collide with a reality no planner had expected. June 4th, 1942. 10:22 a.m. North Pacific Ocean near Midway Atoll. The sky suddenly fills with the scream of diving aircraft. From nearly 20,000 feet above the Pacific, the Douglas SBD, dauntless dive bombers from USS Enterprise plunge toward the Japanese carrier formation. Their wings vibrate violently as the pilots push their aircraft into near-vertical descent. Inside the cockpit of one of the leading aircraft, Lieutenant Richard Halsey Best locks his sights onto the massive carrier Akagi. Below him, the Japanese fleet is caught in a moment of terrible vulnerability. Flight decks are crowded with aircraft. Fuel hoses run across hangar floors. Bombs and torpedoes sit exposed beside partially rearmed planes. Zero fighters that had been chasing torpedo bombers now fly low over the water far below the diving Dauntless aircraft. For a few crucial seconds, the carriers have almost no protection from above. On the bridge of Akagi, Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo looks up. Dark shapes fall from the sky. Someone shouts a warning. Dive bombers. The attack unfolds in seconds. The first American bomb slams into the deck of Kaga. The explosion punches through the flight deck and detonates inside the hangar where fueled aircraft are waiting. Fire erupts instantly. Fuel ignites. Explosions cascade through the interior of the ship. Within moments, the carrier is engulfed in flames. Seconds later, more bombs strike. Soryu is hit repeatedly. Flaming aircraft scatter across the deck. Ordnance detonates in chain reactions. Inside the hangars, men struggle desperately to fight fires that spread faster than hoses can control. Meanwhile, Lieutenant Best releases his bomb directly above Akagi. The weapon falls cleanly toward the center of the flight deck. The explosion tears open the deck and ignites aviation fuel stored below. Flames spread rapidly through the hangar levels. Within minutes, 3 of Japan's 4 carriers are burning beyond control. On board the surviving carrier, Hiryu officers stare across the water in disbelief. Columns of smoke tower into the sky. Akagi burns. Kaga burns. Soryu burns. The most powerful carrier strike force ever assembled has been shattered in less than 10 minutes. Inside the Japanese command structure, shock spreads rapidly. Admiral Nagumo survives the first explosions, but the situation around him is catastrophic. Fire crews struggle against walls of flame. Explosions ripple through the interior compartments. Aircraft ammunition detonates unpredictably. By late morning, the flagship Akagi is effectively lost. Yet the battle is not finished. Hiryu remains operational. Rear Admiral Tamen Yamaguchi, commanding Hiryu's air group, immediately orders counterattacks. Japanese dive bombers launch toward the American fleet. Their target becomes USS Yorktown. Shortly after noon, the Japanese aircraft find her. Bombs strike the carrier's deck. Explosions rip through the flight deck and hangar levels. Smoke rises across the ship. But American damage control teams move quickly. Fire crews attack burning fuel. Repair parties restore power. Within hours, Yorktown appears operational again. Japanese reconnaissance aircraft spot the carrier later that afternoon. Believing they are attacking a second American carrier, Hiryu launches another strike. This time, torpedo bombers approach low over the water. 2 torpedoes strike Yorktown's hull. The explosions flood engineering compartments. The ship finally loses power. Yorktown begins listing heavily. But even now, the American fleet continues fighting. Meanwhile, American scouts search for the last surviving Japanese carrier. By mid-afternoon, they find it. Hiryu. Dive bombers from USS Enterprise and USS Yorktown converge on the target. The attack begins shortly after 5 p.m. Bombs crash into Hiryu's flight deck. Explosions ignite aircraft and fuel. Within minutes, the final Japanese carrier is burning uncontrollably. By nightfall, all 4 carriers that had launched the attack on Pearl Harbor are crippled or destroyed. Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, each had once represented the pride of the Imperial Japanese Navy. Each had helped deliver the devastating surprise attack 6 months earlier. Now they drift across the Pacific as burning wrecks. Inside Japanese naval headquarters, thousands of miles away, the first reports arrive slowly. Initial messages are confused. Then clearer transmissions confirm the truth. 4 carriers lost. Hundreds of experienced pilots missing. Dozens of elite aircraft destroyed. The shock inside Tokyo is profound. Yet even now, many officers struggle to accept the full meaning of what has happened. Midway is seen as a severe setback, a tragic loss, but not necessarily the end of Japan's strategic position. After all, Japan still holds vast territories across the Pacific. Its armies dominate Southeast Asia. Its navy still possesses battleships, cruisers, and submarines. Perhaps the United States will still lose the will to continue. Perhaps the American public will tire of long war once the casualties grow larger. The belief that shaped Japanese strategy for years does not collapse immediately, even after Midway. But far across the Pacific, inside American shipyards and factories, a different momentum has already begun. New aircraft carriers are under construction. New pilots are entering training programs. Production lines are expanding faster than anyone in Tokyo fully understands. And the destruction of 4 carriers in one afternoon has created a gap in Japanese naval power that cannot easily be replaced. The turning point has already occurred, but the full consequences are still hidden beneath the smoke rising from the Pacific. June 6, 1942, 3:40 a.m. Imperial Japanese Navy Headquarters, Tokyo. Rain taps softly against the windows of the operations building as a group of exhausted officers gathers around a long wooden table. Electric lamps cast harsh light across maps of the Pacific Ocean covered with colored pins and grease pencil markings. The atmosphere in the room is tense. Vice Admiral Matome Ugaki, Chief of Staff to Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, reads the latest decoded transmission from the combined fleet. 4 carriers lost. Hundreds of aircraft destroyed. Many of the Navy's most experienced aviators missing. The message ends abruptly. For several seconds, no one speaks. 6 months earlier, those same carriers had delivered the devastating strike on Pearl Harbor. Their pilots were among the most highly trained naval aviators in the world. Many had spent years perfecting carrier operations, torpedo attacks, and coordinated strike tactics. Now they are gone. Ugaki lowers the message slowly. Admiral Yamamoto stands at the far end of the room, studying the Pacific map. His face remains calm, but his eyes are fixed on the location marked Midway. The plan had seemed flawless. Lure the American carriers into battle, destroy them, restore the psychological shock of Pearl Harbor, force the United States into negotiation. Instead, the opposite has happened. The Japanese carrier force has been shattered, and the American fleet still sails. But the implications go far beyond ships. Every carrier lost at Midway carried its own air group, pilots who had spent years mastering the difficult art of carrier landings at night. Navigators trained to guide strike groups across thousands of miles of open ocean. Torpedo specialists who had practiced coordinated attacks since the early 1930s. Japan's training system had always been selective and slow. Only the most skilled candidates were accepted. Years passed before a naval aviator was considered combat-ready. The system produced exceptional pilots, but it produced very few of them. Now hundreds are gone. Replacing them will take time. Japan does not have. Inside the operations room, several staff officers begin discussing immediate options. The Navy must preserve what remains of its strength. The defensive perimeter across the Pacific must be reinforced. Bases in the Solomon Islands and New Guinea become increasingly important. If Japan can block American advances in that region, it may still maintain control of the Central Pacific. Yamamoto listens quietly. But the most troubling reports arriving from intelligence officers are not about ships or aircraft. They are about the reaction inside the United States. Japanese diplomatic observers in neutral countries begin sending summaries of American newspapers. Headlines across the United States celebrate the victory at Midway. The tone of the articles is not cautious or weary. It is confident. Factories are increasing production. Shipyards are launching new vessels. Recruitment centers report overwhelming numbers of volunteers. The reaction is the exact opposite of what Japanese planners expected. Instead of weakening American morale, the war appears to be strengthening it. Meanwhile, across the Pacific, American commanders are already preparing their next moves. August 7th, 1942. 6:15 a.m. Guadalcanal, Solomon Islands. Gray clouds hang low over the jungle-covered island as the engines of landing craft roar toward the beaches. United States Marines grip their rifles as the boats cut through shallow waves. Many of them are young men who enlisted after Pearl Harbor. Others are experienced soldiers transferred from earlier deployments. At the front of the formation rides Major General Alexander Archer Vandergrift, commanding the 1st Marine Division. Ahead of them lies Guadalcanal. The island itself seems quiet. Dense jungle rises behind narrow beaches, but hidden beyond the trees lies a partially constructed Japanese airfield. If completed, that airfield will allow Japanese aircraft to threaten shipping routes between the United States and Australia. Admiral Chester Nimitz has decided the risk cannot be tolerated. For the first time since the war began, American forces are launching a major offensive. The landing craft grind onto the beach. Ramps drop. Marines surge forward across the sand. Within hours, they capture the unfinished airfield. Engineers begin expanding the runway almost immediately. Soon it receives a new name, Henderson Field. For Japanese commanders, the news is alarming. The Americans are not waiting behind defensive lines. They are attacking. Inside the Japanese command structure, confusion spreads about how to respond. Initial reports suggest the American force on Guadalcanal is small, perhaps only a few thousand troops. The Imperial Japanese Army begins sending reinforcements. But the jungle terrain, tropical diseases, and American naval resistance make the situation increasingly complex. Night battles erupt in the waters around the island. Destroyers exchange gunfire in darkness. Cruisers maneuver through narrow channels. Aircraft from Henderson Field attack Japanese ships attempting to deliver supplies. The fighting becomes brutal and chaotic. Yet the deeper shock for Japanese planners lies elsewhere. The United States has chosen not to negotiate. Not after Pearl Harbor. Not after months of early defeats. Not even after the enormous losses of the opening campaigns. Instead, the Americans are attacking sooner than expected. Much sooner. Inside the naval headquarters in Tokyo, intelligence officers continue reviewing American industrial reports. The numbers begin to grow disturbing. New aircraft carriers under construction. Mass production of aircraft expanding rapidly. Training programs for thousands of new pilots underway. Japanese strategists had assumed that the American public would pressure its government to avoid a long war. But the opposite appears to be happening. The longer the war continues, the stronger American mobilization becomes. Still, many leaders inside Japan believe the conflict can be stabilized. Hold the perimeter, inflict heavy casualties, make the cost of victory too high. Eventually, the Americans must reconsider. But the first signs are already appearing that the psychological assumptions behind Japan's strategy were dangerously wrong. And the battle now unfolding in the jungles of Guadalcanal will begin exposing that mistake with brutal clarity. November 13th, 1942, 1:48 a.m., iron-bottom sound waters off Guadalcanal. The night sky is completely black. Heavy clouds cover the moon, and the sea below reflects only the occasional flash of distant gunfire. Inside the narrow waters between Guadalcanal and Savo Island, dozens of warships maneuver cautiously through darkness. Radar screens glow inside American command centers. Lookouts strain their eyes across the water. Somewhere ahead, a powerful Japanese bombardment force approaches. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto has made a decision that reveals how desperate the situation has become. Guadalcanal must be retaken. If the Americans hold Henderson Field, their aircraft will dominate the surrounding seas during daylight. Japanese convoys attempting to supply their troops on the island will remain vulnerable. The airfield has already disrupted Japan's entire defensive strategy in the South Pacific. The original plan had been simple: expand the empire rapidly, establish a massive defensive perimeter, wait for American morale to collapse. Instead, the United States has begun attacking that perimeter less than a year after Pearl Harbor. Now the Japanese Navy must attempt something dangerous. Send battleships close enough to Guadalcanal to destroy Henderson Field with heavy naval artillery. Once the airfield is eliminated, reinforcements can land safely. At the center of the Japanese formation sails the battleship Hiei. Her massive 14-inch guns point toward Guadalcanal. Behind her, the battleship Kirishima follows. Cruisers and destroyers form a protective screen. Their mission is clear: destroy Henderson Field, restore Japanese control of the island. But the Americans are already waiting. Rear Admiral Daniel J. Callahan commands a mixed group of cruisers and destroyers guarding the waters around Guadalcanal. Many of the ships carry the newest radar technology. Inside the cruiser, USS San Francisco radar operators track the approaching Japanese formation. Blips appear across the glowing screen. Enemy ships, very close. The distance between the fleets shrinks rapidly in darkness. Neither side expects the battle to begin this suddenly. At 1:48 a.m., searchlights suddenly ignite across the water. The Japanese destroyer Akatsuki illuminates American ships directly ahead. Within seconds, the night explodes with gunfire. Battleships fire massive salvos. Cruisers unleash rapid barrages. Destroyers launch torpedoes. The two fleets collide in near point-blank combat. The chaos is immediate and terrifying. Ships maneuver blindly through darkness. Gun flashes illuminate towering walls of water. Torpedoes streak across the surface, leaving glowing wakes. Inside the cruiser USS Atlanta, sailors struggle to track targets as enemy shells slam into the ship's hull. Explosions rip through compartments. Fires spread across the deck. Meanwhile, the battleship Hiei fires her massive guns towards American cruisers only a few thousand yards away. The blasts shake the sea. Shells smash into American ships. But the American resistance is far stronger than Japanese commanders expected. Destroyers charge directly toward the battleships. Torpedoes slam into Japanese hulls. Gunfire pounds superstructures. Searchlights illuminate targets on both sides. The battle becomes a swirling melee of ships firing at extremely close range. When dawn finally approaches, the sea is covered with burning wreckage. Several American ships have been lost, but the Japanese formation has also suffered severe damage. Most importantly, the battleship Hiei has been crippled. Her steering damaged, her superstructure shattered. She drifts helplessly in daylight. And daylight means American aircraft from Henderson Field are now coming. Wave after wave of bombers and torpedo aircraft attack the damaged battleship. By evening, Hiei is abandoned and scuttled. The bombardment mission has failed. Henderson Field remains operational, and the Japanese plan to retake Guadalcanal continues collapsing. But the deeper problem facing Japanese commanders is becoming impossible to ignore. Every time they attempt to regain control of the island, American forces return with new ships, new aircraft, new reinforcements. The United States appears capable of replacing losses far faster than Japan can. Japanese naval officers studying intelligence reports begin noticing a pattern. American shipyards are launching new vessels constantly. Aircraft production continues increasing. Training programs for pilots expand month after month. Meanwhile, Japan's own losses become harder to replace. Experienced aviators killed at Midway cannot be recreated quickly. Shipbuilding capacity is limited. Fuel shortages begin appearing. Yet perhaps the most shocking development is still the attitude inside the United States. Japanese intelligence officers continue monitoring American newspapers and radio broadcasts. They expected war fatigue. They expected public pressure to grow as casualties mounted. But the opposite continues happening. The longer the war continues, the stronger the public support appears to become. War bond drives attract millions of citizens. Factories operate day and night. Young men volunteer faster than training centers can process them. The attack on Pearl Harbor has not weakened American morale. It has hardened it. Inside the Japanese command structure, some officers now begin to realize the original strategic assumption may have been fatally flawed. The United States is not collapsing politically. It is mobilizing completely. Yet even with these growing doubts, Japan cannot simply abandon the war. Its armies occupy enormous territories. Its fleet still possesses powerful ships, and leaders still believe that inflicting heavy enough casualties might force the Americans to reconsider. But with every month that passes, the defensive perimeter grows weaker, and the psychological foundation of Japan's war plan is slowly collapsing. The plan that began with the confidence of Pearl Harbor is now unraveling across the waters of Guadalcanal. June 19, 1944. 5:40 a.m. Philippine Sea, west of the Mariana Islands. A pale orange sunrise spreads across the Pacific as the flight decks of Japanese aircraft carriers begin filling with activity. Deck crews rush between aircraft lined in tight rows. Mitsubishi, a 6M50 fighters warm their engines. Yokosuka D-4Y Swiss dive bombers sit armed with bombs beneath their wings. Nakajima B-6N. Tenzin torpedo bombers idle nearby. The fleet moves steadily toward the Mariana Islands. At the center of the formation sails Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa's mobile fleet. The carriers Taiho, Shokaku, Zuikaku, Chitose, Kyoto, Zuiho. For the Imperial Japanese Navy, this operation represents something more than another battle. It is an attempt to restore the balance of the war. Nearly 2 years have passed since the disaster at Midway. Since then, the Americans have advanced relentlessly across the Pacific. Guadalcanal was lost. The Solomon Islands have fallen. Now American forces are landing in the Mariana Islands, threatening Saipan and Guam. If those islands fall, American bombers will be able to reach the Japanese home islands directly. Japanese commanders understand the stakes clearly. The plan is bold. Lure the American carrier fleet into battle. Launch massive coordinated airstrikes. Destroy the carriers. Recreate the decisive victory that Midway had denied them. In Tokyo, the plan carries enormous psychological weight. A major victory could restore confidence, perhaps even weaken American public support for the war. If the United States loses several carriers and thousands of sailors, the political consequences might still force negotiations. The same belief that shaped Japanese strategy in 1941 continues influencing decisions in 1944. But across the ocean, the reality facing the Japanese fleet is very different from the war they began. To the east of Ozawa's carriers sails the United States Fifth Fleet under Admiral Raymond A. Spruance. Within it operates the powerful Fast Carrier Task Force commanded by Vice Admiral Mark Andrew Mitcher. 15 American aircraft carriers move together in disciplined formation. Their decks are crowded with aircraft. Grumman F-6F Hellcat fighters. Curtiss SB-2C Helldiver dive bombers. Grumman TBF Avenger torpedo bombers. Each carrier carries more aircraft than many entire Japanese air groups. Radar operators aboard American ships track incoming aircraft hundreds of miles away. Fighter direction officers guide intercepting planes directly toward approaching threats. The technological and industrial transformation of the war is now visible everywhere. But inside the Japanese mobile fleet, the pilots preparing for launch carry a different burden. Many are young, very young. The experienced aviators who once filled Japanese carrier squadrons were lost in earlier battles. Midway, the Solomons, Guadalcanal. Years of brutal combat have consumed them. Now the cockpits are filled with hastily trained replacements. Some have never experienced real combat, yet they are expected to defeat the most powerful carrier force in history. At 8:30 a.m., Ozawa orders the first strike launched. Dozens of aircraft roar from the carrier decks and climb toward the east. Wave after wave follows. Hundreds of Japanese aircraft now race toward the American fleet. Inside the radar rooms of American carriers, operators watch the incoming formations appear as clusters of glowing signals. Fighter direction officers begin issuing calm instructions. Hellcat fighters launch immediately. Guided by radar, they climb toward intercept points. Minutes later, the sky becomes filled with twisting dogfights. American fighters attack the incoming Japanese formations with devastating effect. The difference in training and aircraft performance becomes painfully obvious. Zero's struggle against the faster, more heavily armed Hellcats. Japanese bombers attempting to reach the fleet are intercepted long before they can approach their targets. Many never see the ships they were meant to attack. One American pilot later describes the battle with a grim phrase. "The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Japanese aircraft fall burning into the sea." Some pilots attempt desperate attacks through intense anti-aircraft fire. Very few succeed. Only a handful of bombs reach American ships. None cause serious damage. Meanwhile, American submarines move silently beneath the waves. One of them, USS Albacore, detects the massive carrier Taiho. A spread of torpedoes launches from the submarine's tubes. One torpedo strikes the carrier's hull. At first, the damage appears manageable, but fuel vapors begin spreading through the ship. Later in the day, a massive internal explosion tears the carrier apart. Taiho sinks beneath the waves. Another submarine, USS Kavala, finds the carrier, Shokaku. 3 torpedoes strike the ship. Fuel ignites. Explosions rip through the hangars. Shokaku sinks as well. By evening, the Japanese mobile fleet has suffered catastrophic losses. Hundreds of aircraft destroyed. 2 fleet carriers sunk. Many more damaged. But the greatest loss is something far less visible. Pilot experience. Most of the young aviators who launched that morning never return. For Japan's naval aviation, the damage is irreversible. Inside Japanese command circles, the reports arriving after the battle are devastating. The Navy has attempted to restore its offensive power. Instead, it has lost what remained of its carrier air strength. Yet perhaps the most bitter realization lies in the political reaction across the Pacific. American newspapers celebrate another victory. Shipyards continue launching new carriers. Aircraft production continues expanding. The war effort shows no sign of weakening, even after years of fighting, even after enormous casualties. The assumption that American morale would eventually collapse now appears dangerously unrealistic. But by 1944, it may already be too late to change the outcome. October 23, 1944. 5:12 a.m. Sibuyan Sea, Central Philippines. Low gray clouds stretch across the morning sky as the massive battleship Musashi cuts slowly through the calm waters of the Sibuyan Sea. Her enormous hull displaces the ocean around her, and her towering superstructure rises like a steel fortress above the fleet. She is one of the most powerful warships ever built. Her 18-inch guns sit inside enormous armored turrets capable of firing shells weighing more than 3,000 pounds. Nearby sails her sister ship, the battleship Yamato. Together they form the core of Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita's center force. Ahead of them lies Leyte Gulf. American forces have begun landing thousands of troops on the island of Leyte as part of the campaign to liberate the Philippines. For the Japanese High Command, this invasion threatens the entire structure of their defensive perimeter. If the Philippines fall, Japan will lose critical shipping routes connecting the home islands to the oil fields of Southeast Asia. Without those supplies, the empire cannot sustain its war effort. The response from Tokyo has been desperate and complex. Operation Shogo, a massive naval counterattack. Multiple Japanese fleets will converge on the American landing forces from different directions. Kurita's powerful battleships will push through the San Bernardino Strait and attack the American invasion fleet directly. Meanwhile, Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa's carrier group will approach from the north. But Ozawa's carriers are not intended to win a battle. They are bait, decoys. The carriers possess very few aircraft after the disaster of the Philippine Sea. Their purpose is simply to draw away the American carrier fleet. If the Americans chase Ozawa, North Kurita's battleships may reach the vulnerable invasion transports. It is a dangerous gamble. But by late 1944, Japan has few other options. On the bridge of Musashi, officers watch the horizon as the fleet advances through the Sibuyan Sea. Lookouts scan the sky constantly. Everyone understands that American aircraft carriers are somewhere nearby, and they arrive sooner than expected. Shortly after 10:30 a.m., radar aboard American carriers detects Kurita's fleet. Within minutes, aircraft begin launching. Helldiver dive bombers, Avenger torpedo bombers, Hellcat fighters. Wave after wave climbs into the sky. Their destination is the enormous Japanese formation moving through the Sibuyan Sea. The first attack arrives just before noon. American aircraft dive toward Musashi. Anti-aircraft guns erupt across the fleet. The battleship's decks shake as hundreds of shells explode into the air. But the attackers continue descending. Bombs fall toward the ship. One explodes near the bow. Another detonates along the starboard side. Moments later, torpedo bombers approach low across the water. 2 torpedoes slam into Musashi's hull. The ship shudders violently. Water begins flooding into damaged compartments. Damage control teams rush into action. Pumps engage. Bulkheads seal. But the attacks continue. Throughout the afternoon, more waves of American aircraft arrive. Each attack brings additional bombs and torpedoes. Musashi absorbs the punishment with astonishing durability. Yet the sheer number of strikes becomes overwhelming. By late afternoon, the battleship has been hit by more than a dozen torpedoes and numerous bombs. Her speed slows. Her list increases. Inside the command spaces, officers begin realizing that even the most powerful battleship cannot survive endless air attacks. Finally, shortly after 7:30 p.m., Musashi rolls slowly onto her side. The enormous ship slips beneath the water. Thousands of sailors struggle in the dark sea. Nearby, Japanese ships attempt rescues as Kurita's fleet continues moving toward Leyte Gulf. But something else is happening far beyond the horizon. Ozawa's carrier decoy force has succeeded. Admiral William F. Halsey, Jr., commanding the powerful United States Third Fleet, has taken the bait. Believing Ozawa's carriers represent the main Japanese threat, Halsey turns his entire fleet north to destroy them. This leaves the San Bernardino Strait temporarily unguarded. During the night, Kurita's battered battleships slip through the passage. At dawn on October the 25th, they encounter an unexpected sight. Ahead of them lies a small American escort carrier group. Tiny carriers, lightly armed destroyers, escort ships protecting transport operations. The American sailors staring across the water at Kurita's approaching battleships understand immediately how dangerous the situation is. The Japanese fleet includes battleships capable of destroying them with a single salvo. Yet what follows reveals something Japanese planners had failed to anticipate throughout the entire war. The American crews do not retreat. Destroyers charge directly toward the battleships. Aircraft launch even without bombs. Pilots make repeated attack runs using machine guns alone. Smoke screens cover the smaller carriers. Every ship fights with desperate determination. The resistance confuses the Japanese commanders. Kurita cannot see the larger American fleets beyond the horizon. He fears a trap. After hours of chaotic combat, he orders his fleet to withdraw. The opportunity to destroy the American invasion fleet disappears, and inside the Japanese naval command structure, the realization begins spreading slowly but unmistakably. Even after years of war, even after devastating casualties, even when facing overwhelming danger, the Americans are still fighting with undiminished resolve. The assumption that American morale would eventually collapse has finally collided with undeniable reality. March 9th, 1945. 11:48 p.m. Tokyo, Empire of Japan. The night sky above the capital glows an unnatural orange. Hundreds of American bombers move steadily through the darkness at low altitude. Their engines rumble like distant thunder as they pass over the sleeping city. Boeing B-29, Superfortress aircraft from the United States Army. Air Force's 21st Bomber Command, spread across the sky in carefully organized formations. Inside one of the bombers, Brigadier General Curtis Emerson LeMay watches the city below through the cockpit window. The aircraft flies barely 5,000 feet above the rooftops, much lower than earlier bombing missions. This time the attack will be different. The bomb bays open. Thousands of incendiary bombs begin falling into the densely packed neighborhoods of Tokyo. Within minutes, fires erupt across the wooden buildings of the city. Wind spreads the flames rapidly. Entire blocks ignite at once. Japanese fire brigades attempt to respond, but the scale of the attack overwhelms them almost immediately. The fires merge together into a massive firestorm. Columns of smoke rise thousands of feet into the air. The heat becomes unbearable across entire districts of the capital. For the citizens below, the destruction is terrifying. Yet for the American commanders directing the bombing campaign, the attack represents something larger. The United States now possesses complete control of the skies above Japan. Hundreds of heavy bombers can reach the home islands regularly. Factories, ports, railways, cities. Everything is within range. The ability to launch these attacks is the result of years of industrial expansion and relentless production. Shipyards launched dozens of new aircraft carriers. Factories produced tens of thousands of aircraft. Training programs created enormous numbers of pilots and technicians. None of it slowed. None of it weakened. The war that Japanese planners believed would break American morale has instead unleashed the full industrial and military power of the United States. Inside the Imperial Japanese government, the reality is now impossible to ignore. The empire's defensive perimeter has collapsed. The Philippines have fallen. Iwo Jima has been captured after brutal fighting. American submarines cut through Japanese shipping routes almost at will. Fuel shortages cripple what remains of the Navy. Aircraft production struggles under constant bombing. Yet perhaps the most devastating realization lies not in the physical destruction. It lies in the failure of the original assumption. Back in 1941, Japanese intelligence believed American society lacked the will to endure long war. They believed shock and early victories would force political compromise. Pearl Harbor was intended to create that shock. Instead, it created fury. Instead of demanding negotiation, the American public demanded total victory. Factories expanded instead of slowing. Recruitment increased instead of declining. Each year of war strengthened the mobilization, and every Japanese defeat strengthened American determination even further. Inside Tokyo, government officials gather in quiet meetings to discuss the situation. The reports arriving from across the Pacific paint a grim picture. Entire carrier fleets lost. Veteran pilots gone. Oil reserves nearly exhausted. Cities burning. Still, the war continues. But the balance of power has shifted so completely that recovery is no longer possible. Far across the Pacific, American fleets move steadily closer to the Japanese home islands. Aircraft carriers patrol the waters around Okinawa. Battleships bombard coastal defenses. Transport ships deliver endless waves of soldiers and equipment. The scale of the American war machine now dwarfs anything Japan can deploy. Yet the most painful understanding arrives quietly inside the minds of the officers who planned the war years earlier. The United States had not been psychologically fragile. It had been provoked. Pearl Harbor had not weakened American morale. It had hardened it beyond anything Japanese planners imagined. The assumption that American society would tire of war had shaped every stage of Japan's strategy. The attack on Pearl Harbor, the expansion across Southeast Asia, the attempt to create an unbreakable defensive perimeter. All of it depended on one belief, that the enemy would eventually stop fighting. Instead, the enemy fought harder with each passing year. And by the time this truth becomes undeniable, the war has already moved beyond Japan's ability to control it. Above the burning city of Tokyo, the bombers turn slowly toward the Pacific. Their mission complete. Below them, the fires continue spreading across the capital. Across the dark ocean, American fleets continue advancing toward Japan. The war that began with the certainty of Pearl Harbor now ends with a realization that arrives far too late.